Will the underground walls hold, or has Solomon truly built a tomb for his only means of survival? The sky is about to turn black, and the temperature is about to drop 40 degrees in minutes. The transition was so violent, it felt like a physical blow to the chest. One moment, the Nebraska prairie was basking in an eerie, unseasonable warmth, and the next, a wall of white pulverized ice slammed into Custer County with the force of a hurricane. This was the Schoolchildren's blizzard. A storm so sudden and so fierce that history books still struggled to capture the sheer horror of it. Within seconds, visibility dropped to zero. You couldn't see your own hand held out in front of your face. For Solomon Butcher, huddled inside his house, the sound was like 1,000 freight trains roaring over his roof. He thought of his horses, tucked away in the underground barn he had been ridiculed for building. Outside, the world was vanishing. The wind was hitting speeds of 60 miles per hour, and the temperature plummeted from above freezing to 20 below zero in a matter of hours. This wasn't just snow falling from the sky. It was a white hurricane, where the fine powdery frost of the plains was whipped into a blinding, suffocating foam that filled your lungs if you tried to breathe. As the hours turned into a day, Solomon's neighbors, the very ones who had laughed at his underground madness, were living through a nightmare. Above ground, the traditional wooden barns were failing. The wind was so strong it peeled the shingles off roofs and drove the freezing snow through the tiniest cracks in the floorboards. Livestock, terrified and blinded, were huddling against the leeward side of fences until the snow drifted so high they were simply walked over by other cattle. Or worse, they were buried standing up. Men who stepped out of their back doors to reach their barns, just 50 feet away, became instantly disoriented in the whiteout. They would wander in circles just yards from their own kitchens until they collapsed from exhaustion and froze to death. Their bodies found days later, just steps from safety. In the midst of this chaos, Solomon sat in his sod house, listening to the earth groan. He knew that while the wind was stripping the paint off every house in the county, his horses were insulated by 6 feet of solid Nebraska earth. The very ground the neighbors mocked was now acting as a thermal blanket, keeping the animals' body heat trapped in a way no wooden barn ever could. But even for Solomon, the fear was paralyzing. If the ventilation shafts he had worked so hard on became plugged with snow, his horses would suffocate in the dark. If the weight of the massive drift, some reaching 20 feet high, became too much for his hand-cut timber beams, the Folly would become a literal mine collapse. He could hear the terrifying crack of the earth settling under the weight of the blizzard. Across the county, the devastation was mounting. Teachers were making the impossible choice to keep children in unheated sod schoolhouses, or try to lead them through the void to a nearby farm. People were burning their furniture just to stay alive. The storm lasted for hours, then days. A relentless wall of white death that seemed like it would never end. Solomon could do nothing but pray that his engineering was as sound as his instincts. He was a man of the lens, a man who saw the truth in shadows. And now, he was betting everything on the shadow he had created beneath the soil. Imagine standing in the middle of a vast, frozen ocean of grass in 1880s Nebraska, where the wind screams so loud you can hear your own thoughts, and the horizon is so flat it feels like the world just ends. This was the frontier, a place where people didn't just live. They survived by the skin of their teeth. But among these hardened settlers, there was one man everyone thought had finally lost his mind. His name was Solomon Butcher. Now, Solomon wasn't your typical farmer. He was a dreamer and a photographer who saw the world through a lens, but his neighbors in Custer County saw him as a bit of a local joke. While every other sensible pioneer was busy reinforcing their sod houses or building sturdy wooden barns above ground to show off their success, Solomon was doing something that looked outright pathetic. He was digging. He wasn't digging a well, and he wasn't digging a cellar for potatoes. Solomon was excavating a massive, sprawling cavern right out of the dirt, directly beneath the earth where his horses were supposed to stand. The locals would ride by on their wagons, pull their hats low against the biting Great Plains wind, and just shake their heads at the sight of soul covered in grime, hauling buckets of dirt out of a hole that looked more like a grave than a stable. They called it Butcher's Folly. In a community where your livestock was your entire net worth, your tractor, your transport, and your survival, the idea of keeping expensive, breathing animals in a dark underground pit seemed like an invitation for rot, disease, or a cabin soul. They'd say, "You're going to bury those poor beasts alive before the winter even hits." They mocked the way he obsessed over the ventilation shafts and the reinforced timber beams he dragged across the prairie. To them, a barn was supposed to stand tall as a monument to a man's hard work, a silhouette against the sunset that proved you had conquered the land. Solomon's barn was invisible, a secret buried in the silt and clay. And as the autumn of 1888 began to fade into a deceptively calm November, the laughter of the neighbors was the only thing louder than the approaching silence of the north. Solomon didn't argue with them much. He just kept digging and documenting the lives of the people around him. capturing the faces of families standing proudly in front of their proper barns. He saw the pride in their eyes, but he also saw the fragility of their wooden structures against a sky that looked increasingly bruised and heavy. He knew the history of this land better than most because he talked to everyone for his photography projects. And he knew that when the Great Plains decided to turn, they didn't just get cold, they became a death trap. On the morning of January 12, 1888, the air was strangely warm, almost like a spring day, leading many children to head to school without coats and farmers to head deep into the fields with their horses. Miles from shelter, but Solomon felt a drop in the pressure that made his bones ache, and he hurried his prized horses into the dark, earthen mouth of his underground stable. He ignored the final sneers of a passing neighbor who was enjoying the January thaw. Little did any of them know, the most terrifying weather event in American history was less than an hour away, and by sunset, that ridiculous hole in the ground would be the only thing standing between life and a frozen grave. When the wind finally dies down and the sun rises over a world transformed into a frozen, alien landscape, who will be left standing? And what will Solomon find when he finally digs his way out to his hidden barn? If you're finding this story as intense as I am, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We uncover the most incredible forgotten moments of human survival every week. When the sun finally broke through the clouds on the third day, the silence was more haunting than the wind had been. The entire landscape of Custer County had been rewritten. Hills were gone, replaced by massive sculpted waves of hard-packed snow that you could walk across without sinking. Solomon Butcher stepped out of his home, or rather, he climbed out of the drift that had entombed his front door and looked toward where his barn should have been. There was nothing, just a flat, white expanse of glittering ice. His heart sank. For all the planning, for all the digging, it looked as though the earth had simply swallowed his livelihood whole. He grabbed a shovel and began the back-breaking work of locating the entrance to his underground stable. He wasn't the only one digging that morning. All across the county, farmers were emerging from their homes to find a scene of absolute carnage. They found their prize cattle frozen solid in the fields, looking like statues. They found their high-standing wooden barns collapse under the weight of the snow or filled to the rafters with fine powder that had suffocated the animals inside. Solomon finally hit wood. He cleared the snow away from the heavy trapdoor he had built into the hillside and braced himself for the smell of death. He hauled the door open, the hinges screaming in the cold, and stepped down into the darkness. To his utter shock and overwhelming relief, he wasn't met with silence. He was met with the warm, humid breath of his horses and the soft, impatient, rhythmic thumping of hooves against the dirt. The temperature inside the underground barn was a staggering 40 degrees warmer than the air outside. The horses were not just alive, they were calm, dry, and completely unaware that a historic catastrophe had just decimated the region. Solomon's Folly had worked perfectly. The earth had protected them from the wind chill, and his carefully placed vents had remained clear enough to provide oxygen. While the snow acted as a secondary layer of insulation, he led his horses out into the blinding Nebraska sun, and as he walked them past the ruins of the neighboring farms, the mockery finally stopped. The story of Solomon Butcher and his underground barn spread through the territory like wildfire. The man they had called a fool was now being hailed as a visionary of frontier engineering. Solomon went on to become the most important photographer of the pioneer era, capturing thousands of images of families in their homes, many of whom began to adopt his dugout style for their own outbuildings. He proved that in a land as unforgiving as the American West, tradition often took a back seat to raw, creative survival. His photos today are the reason we know what the faces of those survivors looked like. But his greatest legacy was you and Tay picture it, was the lives of the animals he saved when everyone else told him he was crazy. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes, the crazy idea is the only one that actually works when the world turns cold. Solomon didn't just survive the great blizzard of 1880, he outsmarted it by looking where no one else dared to look, beneath his feet. Solomon's photos are now legendary, but it was his shovel that saved his future. What's a crazy idea you've had that turned out to be right? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to see the actual photos Solomon took of these pioneers, check out our next video on the screen right now.